What lurks in the silence of Montana's Low National Forest that has a seasoned park ranger questioning everything he's seen in 15 years? Join us to uncover the chilling truth. Get ready to explore the unknown with every step. Subscribe now for the adventure of a lifetime. My name is Olin Morell, and I've been a park ranger at Low National Forest in Montana for a good 15 years now. You'd think a job like mine is all serene landscapes and peaceful walks through the woods, and mostly you'd be right. I spend my days educating hikers, check trails and making sure our little corner of nature stays pristine. I've got a wife, Annie, and a teenage daughter, Becca, who roll their eyes every time I start a story with back when I was out in the woods, but this one I've never told them. It's not your typical ranger tale. It started on an unusually warm fall day, the kind that makes you think summer isn't quite ready to let go. I was out doing a routine check on some of the more isolated trails, the ones that don't see much foot traffic. My buddy Tony Weller, another ranger, was supposed to meet me later to help clear some debris that had been reported blocking part of the Ponderosa Loop. I was about a mile in when I noticed something strange. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally you'd hear the rustling of squirrels, the chirping of birds, even the occasional rustle of a deer, but that day there was nothing, just the crunch of my boots on the path. I remember thinking maybe a predator was nearby, a mountain lion or something. I radioed Tony to see where he was at. "Hey, Tony, you close? It's weirdly quiet out here." "Man," I said, "just about there." "Olin, hold tight," Tony replied, his voice crackling through the static. I decided to keep moving forward, figuring Tony would catch up soon. That's when I saw a deep gouge in one of the ponderosa pines. It wasn't a claw mark from a bear or a cat. It was more like something had ripped into it, with incredible force, leaving a gaping wound in the bark. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I called Tony again. "Tony, you got to see this. It's like something shredded. This tree never seen anything like it on my way," he said, sounding more serious. This time, as I stood there waiting, I started to feel uneasy. It was that gut feeling you get when you know something's off, but can't quite put your finger on it. Then I heard a faint rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low, almost imperceptible hum. My hand went to the can of bear spray on my belt. Not much, but it was something. Tony arrived a few minutes later, puffing slightly from the hike. "What the hell, Olin, that tree looks like. It went through a shredder," he said wide-eyed. "I know, and listen," I said, holding up a hand. The hum had stopped, but the eerie silence remained. We decided to follow the path deeper into the forest. Our curiosity piqued in a sense of duty urging us on. As we walked, we started finding more signs, branches broken in ways that didn't make sense, strange tracks that neither of us could identify. Tony, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe Bigfoot's been hitting the gym," he chuckled. I forced a laugh, but I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. We walked for another half hour, the trail becoming less and less distinct until we reached a clearing. In the middle of it we saw something that made our blood run cold. A tent, or what was left of it, shredded and scattered like confetti. There were no signs of its occupants. Just a couple of backpacks also torn open, with their contents strewn about. It looked like someone or something had gone through them. In a hurry, I picked up a wallet lying in the dirt. The ID inside belonged to a John Raw from Helena. "Tony, we need to call this in, people are missing," I said, already reaching for my radio before I could make the call. We heard that hum again, louder, this time coming from the trees behind us. We turned around slowly, our eyes scanning the dense forest, and then we saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a vague outline, but as it stepped into the clearing, the details became horrifyingly clear. It was humanoid but not human. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, eyes like black voids staring right at us. It had no mouth, but the hum seemed to emanate from its entire body, vibrating the air around it. Tony and I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The creature cocked its head, as if studying us. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged at Tony, who barely had time to scream before it was on him. I watched in horror, as it tore into him with its long clawed fingers. Blood sprayed and Tony's screams echoed through the trees. I snapped out of my paralysis and fumbled for the bear spray. I managed to hit the creature with a full blast, but it barely seemed to notice. It turned its head towards me, those black eyes boring into my soul. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes from branches and thorns. I could hear it behind me, the hum growing louder, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead, but I kept going. I had to reach the ranger station, had to get help, bursting out of the forest. I stumbled onto the main trail and nearly collapsed. Another hiker, a young guy named Sam Wexler, saw me and rushed over. "Jesus, man. What happened?" he asked, grabbing my arm to steady me. "No time to explain. We need to get to the station now," I gasped. Sam didn't argue. We made it to the station and I slammed the door behind us, bolting it shut. I grabbed the radio and called for backup, my voice shaking. "Mayday, mayday. This is Ranger Olin Morell at Low Station. We have an emergency. Tony Weller is down and there's something out there. We need help now." The response was immediate. Other rangers and local authorities mobilized quickly, and within the hour the area was swarming with law enforcement and search teams. They found Tony's body, or what was left of it. The sight was grisly and I had to look away. The search for the creature turned up nothing, no tracks, no signs, nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The forest, which had been so silent, seemed to come back to life as the sun set, the usual sounds of nature returning as if nothing had happened. I gave my statement, recounting everything I'd seen, but I could tell by the looks on their faces that they were skeptical. I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. They chalked Tony's death up to a bear attack, despite the lack of evidence to support it. No one wanted to entertain the idea of something unknown lurking in the forest. I took a leave of absence. After that, spent a lot of time with Annie and Becca trying to process what had happened. I didn't sleep well for weeks, haunted by the image of that thing in Tony's final moments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black voids staring back at me. The forest called me back. Eventually it's my home, my sanctuary, and I couldn't stay away forever. But I'm more cautious now. I stick to the well-traveled paths and I'm never out there alone. I've tried to forget what happened, to move on, but some things you just can't shake, and sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I think I hear that hum again, faint and distant, reminding me that some things are best left unexplored. Life goes on and the forest remains. But I'm not the same man I was. I've seen something that defies explanation, something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world, and maybe that's the scariest part of all that. There are things out there lurking in the shadows that we may never understand. Ever get that feeling? Someone's watching you. Yeah, that one. It's not paranoia, it's survival. You learn that the hard way when you grow up in the sticks, like I did. Name's Everett Mason, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the fall of '97. I'd spent my entire life in Redwood, a small town nestled deep in the forests of Washington state. My family's cabin was a good 10 miles out from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My dad was a logger and my mom ran a small bakery in town. I just tried to survive high school without getting my ass kicked. I was the kind of kid who got his kicks from comic books and old sci-fi movies, not from sports or hunting, like most of the other guys around here. Maybe that's why I never really fit in, but I had my dog, Max, a black lab with more energy than sense, and he was all the company I needed. That day started like any other Saturday. I woke up to the sound of Max barking his head off at some squirrel that dared to come too close to the house. My mom had left a note on the kitchen table reminding me to check the traps we'd set for rabbits. Food was getting scarce, and we needed every bit of meat we could get. Dad was already out in the woods, probably felling trees or fixing the old generator that powered our cabin. I grabbed my boots, threw on a flannel shirt, and headed out with Max leading the way. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, with rays of sun piercing through the dense canopy, and the smell of pine in the air. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination and the eerie quiet that only the deep woods can conjure. I found the first trap empty. The second one too. Damn, we really needed those rabbits. As I moved towards the third, Max's demeanor changed. He went from bouncing around like an idiot to standing completely still. Ears perked and hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Max growled low in his throat, something I'd never heard him do. Before my heart started to pound. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a fox, but deep down I knew better. There was something out there, something watching us. I decided to head back to the cabin, hoping to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but all I saw were trees and shadows back at the cabin. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I made a sandwich, watched some TV, and even tried to read a comic book, but I couldn't focus. Max was still on edge too, pacing around the room and whining. That's when I heard a scream, not the kind of scream you hear in horror movies, all exaggerated and fake. No, this was real, raw and filled with terror. It came from the direction of the logging site where my dad was working. I bolted out of the cabin, Max at my heels, and ran towards the sound. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it a bear, a cougar, or something else? As I neared the site, the smell hit me first, the coppery tang of blood. I skipped to a stop, my heart hammering in my chest. The clearing was a mess of broken trees and torn earth, and in the middle of it all was my dad, or what was left of him. I won't go into the gory details, but it was bad, really bad. I stood there frozen in shock until Max started barking like mad again. That's when I saw it, a massive figure just at the edge of the clearing. It was covered in matted fur, standing on two legs like a man, but easily twice the size its eyes. Oh God, its eyes were filled with a malevolent intelligence. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature took a step towards me, and that's when Max charged. He was a good dog, brave. To the end he didn't stand a chance. The creature swatted him aside. Like he was nothing, that snapped me out of my stupor. I turned and ran, not caring where, just away from that thing. Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned, but I kept going. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer and closer. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into a clearing. There was a cabin there, not ours, but one I'd seen before on hikes with my dad. It belonged to Old Man Hargrave, a hermit who lived even deeper in the woods than we did. I banged on the door, screaming for help. Hargrave opened it, shotgun in hand, and pulled me inside. I babbled out what had happened, and he just nodded grimly. "We need to stay quiet," he said. "It's a Bigfoot. I've seen it before, killed my brother 10 years ago." We sat in silence. The only sound, my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I could hear it outside sniffing around searching for us. Hargrave motioned for me to stay still and crept towards the window. Suddenly there was a crash as the creature smashed through the wall. Hargrave fired the shotgun, but it barely slowed the thing down. It grabbed him and, with a sickening crunch, snapped his neck like a twig. I scrambled for the door, but the creature was on me. In an instant, its hand closed around my leg and I felt a sharp pain as it dragged me towards it. I kicked and screamed, but it was no use. It was going to kill me, just like it had killed my dad and Hargrave. Just when I thought it was all over, there was a deafening roar, not from the creature, but from a chainsaw. My dad had always kept one in the cabin, and in my panic I'd forgotten about it. Hargrave must have had one too, because now it was roaring to life and the creature howled in pain. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I bolted out the door and ran. I ran until my legs gave out and then I crawled. Eventually I made it back to town, battered, bloody and barely alive. The sheriff didn't believe me, of course. Who would they chalked it up to a bear attack said I was lucky to be alive, but I know what I saw. I know what killed my dad and Max, and I know it's still out there somewhere in the woods waiting. I moved away from Redwood after that, went to live with my aunt in the city. I don't go hiking anymore, don't go near the woods. I tried to forget to move on, but some things you just can't shake. So if you ever find yourself out in the deep woods, and you get that feeling someone's watching you, trust your gut. It might just save your life. In the weeks that followed, the events of that day were etched into my mind not as nightmares, but as a harsh reality check. I didn't dwell on the horror, but used it as a reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of the world. I stayed with my aunt for a while and we rarely spoke about what happened. She knew better than impress me on details. Understanding that some things are better left buried. I took up a job in a local bookstore, finding solace in the mundanity of shelving books and assisting customers. It was a far cry from the adrenaline of the woods, but it was exactly what I needed. People in town talked about the bear attack for a while. Then it became just another tale, a cautionary story. Parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far into the forest. Life moved on, as it always does. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of the old woods on TV or in a photo, and I'd feel a shiver of recognition. But I never went back. Redwood was a part of my past, a place where I lost too much. In the end, I didn't let the terror define me. I found new routines, new joys and new ways to live my life, but I always kept an eye on the tree line just in case, because out there, in the shadowy depths of the forest, I knew something still watched, waiting for another chance to emerge from the darkness. My name is Richard Albright, and this happened to me back in 2013, when I was a deputy sheriff in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. I was born and raised here, knew everyone and everything about this place. Small-town cop life was usually uneventful, with the occasional drunk dispute or petty theft. I liked my job, liked feeling useful. I had a wife, Lila, and 2 kids, Jane and Bobby. Life was good, or so I thought. One day I got a call about a missing person. Not uncommon. People sometimes went off-grid for a few days. This one was different, though. It was Clara Becker, an elderly woman who lived alone near the outskirts. Her neighbor, Mrs. Henson, reported that Clara wasn't the type to go missing. She was routine, bound, set in her ways. Mrs. Henson was frantic, said she hadn't seen Clara for days and her dog, Rufus, was barking non-stop. I drove out to Clara's place. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the sparse desert landscape. Clara's house was a modest single-story, paint peeling off in chunks. Rufus was tied to the porch barking his head off. I knocked on the door, but no answer. I went around back and found the door slightly ajar. I called out, "Clara, it's Deputy Albright, you in there?" Silence inside the house was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. It didn't look like a robbery, more like a struggle. I moved through the house room by room until I got to the bedroom. That's when I saw the blood. A lot of it, too much. It was splattered on the walls, pooled on the floor. No sign of Clara, just the carnage left behind. I radioed in, called for backup. Sheriff McMillan and a few others arrived within minutes. We taped off the scene, started a search. The whole town got involved, combing the area. No sign of Clara, just gone, vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks and we still had nothing. No leads, no suspects. Clara's case went cold, but then more people started disappearing. First it was Tom Jenkins, a mechanic, then Maria Alvarez, a teacher at the high school. The pattern was the same struggle, blood, no bodies. The town was in a panic and I was at a loss. I'd never dealt with anything like this before. One night I was on patrol driving the empty streets when I saw a figure in the distance. It was a man walking along the road. As I got closer, I realized it was Tom Jenkins. I pulled over, got out of the car. "Tom, is that you?" He turned to face me and I almost didn't recognize him. He was gaunt, pale, eyes sunken in. "Richard." He said, his voice barely a whisper. "Help me." I rushed to him, but before I could reach him he collapsed. I radioed for an ambulance and they took him to the hospital. The doctors were baffled. He was dehydrated, malnourished, covered in bruises and cuts, but he was alive. When he woke up, he told us what happened. He'd been taken by a man kept in a basement somewhere. The man tortured him, kept him locked up, feeding him just enough to keep him alive. He couldn't remember much, just bits and pieces, a basement, the smell of mold and decay, the sound of dripping water. It wasn't much, but it was something. We started searching basements, old buildings, any place that fit the description. It was a long shot, but we had to try. Meanwhile, more people went missing. It felt like we were chasing a ghost. One night I was at home trying to get some rest, when I heard a noise outside. It was Rufus, Clara's dog. He was scratching at the door, whining. I let him in and he bolted straight to the kitchen. He pawed at the floor, sniffing furiously. I followed him, and that's when I noticed the trapdoor. I'd never seen it before. It was hidden under a rug, almost invisible. I opened the trapdoor, shone my flashlight down a set of stairs, led into darkness. Rufus whined again, pacing nervously. I took a deep breath, started down the stairs. The air was cold, damp. The smell of mold was strong. At the bottom I found a corridor lined with doors. Each door had a small barred window, like a prison cell. I walked down the corridor, peering into each cell. Most were empty, but then I saw her. Clara huddled in the corner, barely alive. I called out to her, and she looked up, eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, Clara. I'm here to help." I tried the door, but it was locked. I searched the corridor, found a set of keys hanging on a hook. I unlocked the door, helped Clara out. She was weak, could barely stand. I carried her up the stairs back to my car. I radioed for backup, and we got her to the hospital. She was in bad shape, but she'd make it. Clara told us what she could. She'd been taken by a man kept in that basement for weeks. He'd come down every few days, bring food, water, but never spoke. She never saw his face, always covered by a hood. The description matched what Tom had said. We kept searching, but the man was always one step ahead. He knew the area too well, knew how to hide. The disappearances continued and the town was in a state of constant fear. Then one day we got a break. A hiker found a body in the woods, mutilated beyond recognition. We identified it as Maria Alvarez. It was a gruesome scene, but it gave us a clue. The body had been left out in the open like a message. The man was getting bolder, more brazen. We set up a perimeter, increased patrols. Everyone was on edge waiting for the next move. Then late one night I got a call. Another body had been found, this time near the old abandoned mill. I raced over, found Sheriff McMillan already there. It was Tom Jenkins again, this time dead. His body was posed almost ritualistically. The killer was taunting us. We canvassed the area, looking for anything that might lead us to the killer. Then we found a trail of blood leading into the mill. We followed it, guns drawn ready for anything. Inside it was dark, musty. The floor was covered in debris, old machinery rusting away. We moved slowly, methodically, until we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone hammering. We followed the sound, found a hidden door behind a stack of crates. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down. The tapping grew louder. As we descended at the bottom, we found a large room dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a man, his back to us, working on something. He didn't hear us approach. "Sheriff's Department, freeze!" McMillan shouted. The man turned and I got my first look at him. He was tall, thin, with wild eyes and a manic grin. He held a hammer in one hand, a chisel in the other. Behind him, I saw a workbench covered in blood. Various tools and instruments scattered about. He didn't freeze. Instead he lunged at us, swinging the hammer. McMillan fired, hitting him in the shoulder. The man staggered back, but kept coming. I fired next, hitting him in the chest. He fell to the ground, gasping for breath. We approached cautiously. Guns still trained on him. He was still alive, but barely. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do this?" He looked up at me, eyes glassy with pain, because he rasped. "It was fun." He died before we could get any more out of him. We searched the room, found more evidence of his gruesome work. He'd been keeping trophies, pieces of his victims, like some twisted collector. It was a nightmare come to life. The town slowly began to recover. The disappearances stopped, but the scars remained. Clara and the others who survived never fully healed physically or mentally. Life went on, but the shadow of what happened lingered. I stayed on the force for a few more years, but I was never the same. The job lost its appeal, the weight of what I'd seen and done too much to bear. I retired early, moved away with Lila and the kids, hoping for a fresh start. But sometimes late at night I still hear the tapping. The sound haunts my dreams, a reminder of the evil that once lurked in Santa Rosa. And though the killer is gone, his memory remains a dark stain on my soul that will never truly fade. I often wonder what drives a person to such madness. What darkness lies within the human heart? I never found the answers, but maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unexplored. Lord, some truths too terrible to uncover. All I know is this evil exists, and it can wear the face of anyone, hide behind the most innocent of smiles. And in a quiet town like Santa Rosa, it can thrive unnoticed until it's too late. My name is Jasper Concade, and this happened to me on November 14, 2005. I remember that day clearly, not because it started any different from any other, but because it marked the beginning of the most harrowing experience of my life. I work as a search and rescue officer stationed out in the remote corners of Montana. It's not a glamorous job, but it's one that I've always found fulfilling. On this particular day, we got a call about a missing hiker, a young woman named Emily Foster, who had gone off the grid for over 24 hours. Her family was frantic and the local authorities needed our expertise to comb through the dense forest. My partner for the day was Bill Thornton, a solid guy who had been with the team for over a decade. Bill and I set out early, armed with the usual gear, GPS, radios, first aid kits and enough supplies to last a couple of days if needed. We didn't expect to be out that long, but the wilderness can be predictable. We started our search at the trailhead where Emily's car had been found. The initial stretch was easy enough, well-trodden paths that even a novice hiker could navigate. We called out her name every few minutes, listening for any sign of life. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the paths became less defined and the trees seemed to close in around us. Bill and I split up to cover more ground, staying within radio contact. I took the northern route, a steep incline that tested my stamina. As I climbed, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. After about an hour, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It matched the description of the jacket Emily had been wearing. I radioed Bill, and he made his way over to me. Together we followed the faint trail, eyes scanning for more clues. We found more pieces of fabric and even a few footprints, but they led us to a place that wasn't on any of our maps. It was an old cabin hidden away among the trees. The wood was weathered, the windows dark and empty. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. "Should we check it out?" Bill asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, "might be where she took shelter." We approached the cabin cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The place was a mess. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. But in one corner, we found something that made our blood run cold, a fresh set of footprints leading down to a cellar door. Bill and I exchanged glances, and I could see the same question in his eyes. "What the hell is down there?" We descended the rickety stairs, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The cellar was pitch black and the beam from our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. We found Emily huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with fear. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn and she had scratches and bruises all over her body. She looked at us with a mixture of relief and terror, like she couldn't believe we were real. "We are here to help," I said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly and Bill and I helped her to her feet. As we made our way back up the stairs, Emily kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to come out of the shadows. Once outside, she broke down in tears, clutching at us like we were her lifeline. We radioed for a medevac, and while we waited, Emily told us what had happened. She had gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin, thinking it would be a safe place to rest. But she wasn't alone. There was someone already there. She described a tall, gaunt figure that moved with unnatural speed, its eyes glinting in the dark. It had attacked her, and she had barely managed to escape into the cellar. Bill and I exchanged uneasy glances. It sounded like the ramblings of someone in shock, but the fear and in her eyes was all too real. We stayed with her until the helicopter arrived and then made our way back to the station. The next few days were a blur of reports and debriefings. Emily was taken to the hospital where she recovered physically, but she was never quite the same. The doctors chalked it up to trauma, and the official report listed her encounter as a possible animal attack, but Bill and I knew there was more to it. A week later I couldn't get the cabin out of my mind. I needed to know if there was any truth to Emily's story. Bill agreed to go back with me, and we set out early in the morning determined to get some answers. The cabin was just as we left it, but this time we came prepared. We brought extra flashlights, cameras and even a couple of hunting rifles. We weren't taking any chances. As we explored the cabin, we found more signs of recent activity: footprints, discarded food wrappers, and what looked like makeshift bedding, but the cellar was empty. Save for the lingering sense of unease, we decided to stay the night, hoping to catch whoever, or whatever had attacked Emily. As the sun set, the forest around us seemed to come alive with sounds. The wind rustled the leaves and we could hear the distant calls of animals. But as the night wore on, those sounds faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Around midnight, we heard a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. Bill and I exchanged a glance and readied our rifles. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the cellar. We moved quietly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cellar door was ajar and the scraping sound was unmistakable. Now we descended the stairs, guns at the ready in the beam of our flashlights. We saw a tall gaunt figure, just as Emily had described. It was hunched over, its long fingers dragging along the floor. Its eyes glinted in the dark, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. "Stop right there!" Bill shouted, but the figure didn't respond. It lunged at us, moving faster than I could react. Bill fired his rifle, the shot echoing through the cellar. The figure let out a guttural cry and collapsed to the ground. We approached cautiously, but it was clear the thing was dead up close. It looked even more grotesque. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were a milky white. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't human. We called it in, and the next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The authorities arrived and the cabin was sealed off. They took the body away, but we never got any answers. The official report listed it as an unidentified EFED creature, and the case was quietly closed. In the weeks that followed, life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. After an experience like that, Emily recovered, but she moved away, unable to face the memories of what had happened. Bill and I continued our work, but we were more cautious, always on edge. I often think about that night, about the thing we found in the cellar. I wonder if there are more like it out there, hiding in the dark corners of the world. It's a thought that keeps me up at night, but I try not to dwell on it. Life goes on and the forest remains silent and impenetrable, but every now and then, when the wind is just right, I hear that soft scraping sound, and I remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Quentin Marlowe, and this all went down in 1995. I was just an ordinary guy with an ordinary job, as an insurance adjuster. I've been living in the quiet town of Jasper, Alabama, for most of my life. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest excitement is the annual county fair. I was 35, then recently divorced and trying to get my life back together. I spent most of my days dealing with claims and disputes, and my evenings were filled with TV dinners and reruns of old sitcoms. Life was simple, predictable and, frankly, a bit dull. That is, until everything changed one particularly humid August. It was late, probably around 11:00 p.m., when I got a call from my buddy, Miles Petrovich. Miles was a bit of a wild card, the kind of guy who'd call you up for a fishing trip at 3:00 a.m., or drag you to some out-of-the-way bar on a weeknight. But he was a good friend, one of the few I had left after the divorce. "Quentin, man. You got to come out here," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and urgency. "You won't believe what I found." I sighed, already half regretting agreeing to pick up the phone. "Miles. It's late. What could possibly be so important? Just get out here. I'm at the old Henderson farm by the woods. Trust me, you don't want to miss this." The Henderson farm had been abandoned for years, ever since old man Henderson passed away, and his kids moved to the city. It was a rundown place, overgrown with weeds and crawling with wildlife. Not exactly my idea of a good time, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket and headed out. The drive was short, just a few miles out of town. The road was dark and empty. The only light coming from my headlights, cutting through the thick humid night, when I pulled up to the farm. Miles was waiting by his truck, flashlight in hand. He was grinning from ear to ear, like a kid who just found a treasure map. "Quentin, you're not going to believe this," he said, practically bouncing on his heels. I got out of my car, squinting at him through the dim light. "This better be good, Miles." He led me around the back of the house to a small overgrown path leading into the woods. We walked for what felt like forever, the thick canopy of trees blocking out what little moonlight there was. Finally we reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old well covered in moss, and surrounded by an assortment of strange ancient-looking stones. Miles pointed his flashlight down the well, and I could see something glinting faintly at the bottom. "Look down there," he said, his voice a whisper. "Now what do you think that is?" I leaned over, squinting to get a better look. It was hard to make out, but it looked like some kind of metal object I don't know. Maybe an old bucket or something. Miles shook his head. "No, it's something else. I think it might be valuable. Maybe some kind of artifact." I rolled my eyes. "Miles, you dragged me out here in the middle of the night to show me some rusty old junk." He laughed. "Come on, don't be such a stick in the mud. Help me get it out of there." Reluctantly I agreed. We found some old rope in the barn, and rigged up a makeshift pulley system. It took a lot of effort, but we finally managed to pull the object to the surface. It was a small, intricately designed box covered in strange symbols and carvings. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, turning the box over in my hands. It was surprisingly heavy, and there was no obvious way to open it. Miles was practically buzzing with excitement. "I have no idea, but it looks old, really old. Maybe we should take it to the university in Birmingham, see if they can tell us anything about it." I wasn't so sure. The whole thing felt off, like we were messing with something we shouldn't be, but Miles was insistent and I didn't want to argue with him. We agreed to meet up the next day and take the box to the university. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the box, the strange symbols, the eerie feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild. The next morning we loaded the box into my car and headed to Birmingham. The drive was uneventful, and we arrived at the university around noon. We found a professor in the archaeology department, Dr. Lena Rogstad, who agreed to take a look at the box. Dr. Rogstad was a stern woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She examined the box carefully, her expression growing more serious by the minute. "This is remarkable," she said. "Finally, I've never seen anything quite like it. The symbols are similar to those found in ancient European artifacts, but there's something different about them." She looked up at us, her eyes narrowing. "Where did you find this?" Miles and I exchanged a glance. "We found it in an old well out in the woods near Jasper," I said. Dr. Rogstad frowned. "I'd like to keep this for further study. If that's all right with you, there might be more to this than we realize." We agreed to leave the box with her, and she promised to contact us if she found anything significant. As we left the university, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting involved in something way over our heads. A few days passed and life went back to normal. I was beginning to forget about the whole thing when I got another call from Miles. This time he sounded scared. "Quentin, something's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to go back to the farm." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" "It's the box. Ever since we found it, weird things have been happening. I've been hearing noises at night, seeing shadows moving outside my window. I think we are being watched." I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, but the fear in his voice was real. I agreed to meet him at the farm again, hoping to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. When I arrived, Miles was already there, pacing back and forth. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. "Quentin, you got to see this," he said, leading me back to the clearing. The well was still there, but something was different. The street stones around it had been rearranged, forming a rough circle. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, feeling a growing sense of unease. "I don't know, but it wasn't like this before," Mill said, "and that's not all. Look at this." He handed me a piece of paper covered in the same strange symbols as the box. I found this on my doorstep this morning. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We need to get rid of that box. I said, whatever it is, it's causing all of this. Miles nodded, his face pale, but how dear Rogstad still has it. Then we go back to the university and get it. I said, already, heading back to my car. The drive to Birmingham was tense, neither of us saying much. When we arrived at the university, we went straight to Dr. Rad's office, but she wasn't there. We asked around and finally found a janitor, who told us she'd been called away on an emergency. No one seemed to know where she was or when she'd be back. Frustrated, we decided to wait for her in a nearby cafe as we sat there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked around, I saw people glancing our way, whispering to each other. Finally, after what felt like hours, Dia Rogstad walked in. She looked flustered. Her hair disheveled. "Quentin Miles. What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes darting around nervously. "We need the box," I said. "We think it's causing some kind of disturbance." Dia Rogstad sighed, rubbing her temples. "I was just about to call you. There's something you need to know." She led us back to her office and closed the door behind us. "I've been studying the box and I believe it's some kind of ancient artifact, possibly connected to a long-forgotten cult. The symbols are warnings not to open it." Miles and I exchanged a worried glance. "Then we need to get rid of it," I said. Rogstad nodded. "I agree, but it's not that simple. The box is locked with a mechanism that I haven't been able to decipher. And there's more. Last night someone broke into my office and tried to steal it. I think they were part of the same cult that created it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "We need to leave now." We grabbed the box and hurried out of the university. As we drove back to Jasper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every car that appeared in our rearview mirror seemed to stay there just a little too long. When we finally reached the farm, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. We decided to bury the box back in the well, hoping that would put an end to whatever was happening. As we lowered the box into the well, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I turned to see a figure emerging from the trees, its eyes glowing in the dim light. "What the hell is that?" Miles whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stepped into the clearing and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was tall, covered in dark fur, with long clawed hands and a snout like a wolf's. Its eyes were a sickly yellow, filled with an unnatural intelligence. Before we could react, it lunged at us, moving with incredible speed. Miles was closest and the creature knocked him to the ground, its claws slashing through his flesh. I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at the creature, hitting it across the back. It barely flinched, turning its attention to me. I backed away, my heart pounding, but it was too fast. It pounced, knocking me to the ground, its claws digging into my shoulder. I screamed, trying to fight it off, but it was too strong. Just when I thought it was over, a gunshot rang out and the creature recoiled, a bullet wound appearing in its side. Dia Rogstad stood at the edge of the clearing, a revolver in her hand. "Get away from them," she shouted, firing again. The creature howled in pain and turned to flee, disappearing into the woods. I struggled to my feet, my shoulder throbbing with pain. "Miles!" I gasped, rushing to his side. He was bleeding badly. His face pale. "We need to get him to a hospital," Dia Rogstad said, helping me lift him. We managed to get Miles into the car and sped towards the nearest hospital. By the time we arrived, he was barely conscious. The doctors took him into surgery immediately, and I could only hope he'd pull through. As we waited, Dia Rogstad explained what she'd learned. The creature was a werewolf, a guardian of the box bound to protect it at all costs. The cult that created the box believed it held the key to some ancient power, and they'd do anything to get it back. We decided to bury the box in an undisclosed location far away from Jasper, hoping that would keep the cult and the creature away. It was a risk, but we didn't see any other option. Miles survived, but he was never the same. The attack left him scarred both physically and mentally. He moved away, wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and the events of that night. As for me, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible to forget what had happened. Every time I heard a rustling in the bushes, or saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, I felt a surge of fear. We never saw the creature again, but I knew it was still out there waiting, watching, and I knew that the box, with all its dark secrets, was something best left buried and forgotten. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if we made the right choice. Maybe we should have destroyed the box, tried to end the curse once and for all, but at the time, we were just trying to survive to keep ourselves and those we cared about safe. Now, years later, the events of that night still haunt me. I can only hope that the box remains hidden, its secrets lost to time, and that the creature, and the cult that created it never find what they are looking for. My name is Brendan Kinnan, and what I'm about to tell you happened in 2010. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where life was pretty uneventful. I wasn't much of a thrill seeker, more of a guy who preferred a quiet weekend with friends, maybe a couple of beers in a football game. I worked as an IT specialist, which, as you can imagine, doesn't come with a lot of excitement. I had a couple of close friends, Rafe and Simon, who were always up for a getaway when the monotony of our 9-to-5 lives got to us. Rafe was the practical one. He managed a local hardware store and always had a solution to any problem. Simon, on the other hand, was a bit of a wild card. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant he had a lot of free time and a tendency to get us into odd situations. Our trips usually ended up being some combination of RAF's meticulous planning and Simon's spontaneous adventures. One late Friday afternoon, after a particularly grueling week, Simon burst into my office with an idea. He had found a listing for a cabin in the Black Hills of South Dakota, isolated and perfect for a quiet weekend away. Rafe was on board as soon as Simon mentioned it, and I figured why not. I could use a break from staring at screens all day. So we packed up RAF's SUV with essentials, food, beer, fishing gear, and a couple of board games. We left Cedar Rapids early Saturday morning, eager to escape our routine for a few days. The drive was long, but the scenery was worth it. We arrived at the cabin just before dusk. It was a small wooden structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by thick woods. The place was rustic, but it had electricity and running water, which was enough for us. We unpacked, made a quick dinner, and settled in for a night of poker and jokes. By Sunday morning we decided to explore the area. RAF and Simon wanted to go fishing at a nearby lake, while I opted to stay back at the cabin, enjoying the solitude. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, preferring the comfort of a good book and a warm fire. They took off with their gear, leaving me to my own devices. As the day wore on, I started to notice an odd feeling like I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation at the back of my mind. I chopped it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place and tried to ignore it, but it persisted gnawing at me as the hours passed. I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head, convincing myself it was all in my imagination. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines that blocked out much of the sunlight. I didn't stray far, not wanting to get lost, and after a while I headed back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints around the cabin that hadn't been there before. They were large, almost human-like, but with a peculiar shape. Like someone was wearing oddly shaped boots. I felt a chill run through me. I knew RAF and Simon wouldn't be back until evening, so I was alone for the next few hours. I tried to brush it off, reasoning that maybe some local hunters had passed by, but I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the doors and windows, something we hadn't bothered with the night before, and sat by the fire trying to read when Rafe and Simon returned. I told them about the footprints Rafe ever. The practical one suggested it was probably just a prank by some locals or an animal. Simon, on the other hand, seemed intrigued and wanted to go investigate, but I managed to convince him to leave it alone. We had dinner, played more games and eventually went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy for me. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, a soft rustling coming from outside. I lay still listening. It sounded like someone was moving around the cabin just outside the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. Then the noise stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I told myself it was just the wind, or an animal, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning we found the cabin's back door wide open. Rafe, ever the rational thinker, assumed we had forgotten to latch it properly, but I was certain we had locked everything. I could see the doubt in his eyes, though he didn't say anything. Simon, however, was excited. He loved a good mystery, and insisted we explore the area more thoroughly. We spent the day hiking through the woods, looking for any signs of whoever or whatever had been around the cabin. We found more footprints similar to the ones I had seen the day before leading deeper into the forest. Simon wanted to follow them, but Rafe and I managed to convince him to turn back. The last thing we needed was to get lost out there. That evening, as the sun set, we sat around the fire pit outside the cabin trying to make sense of what was happening. The unease from the previous night had returned stronger than before. We were all on edge, jumping at every little noise. I suggested we pack up and head home the next day, cutting our trip short. Rafe agreed, but Simon, ever the adventurer, wanted to stay and figure out what was going on. We eventually convinced him it was better to be safe than sorry. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Every creak and rustle magnified in the darkness. Around midnight I heard it again, the soft rustling outside the cabin. This time I was certain it wasn't my imagination. I got up quietly and grabbed the flashlight, deciding to confront whatever was out there. I woke Rafe and Simon and we cautiously made our way outside. We circled the cabin, shining the flashlight into the woods. At first we saw nothing, just the thick trees and underbrush. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something large and dark was moving through the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. I called out, but there was no response. The figure disappeared into the forest, leaving us standing there bewildered and scared. The next morning we decided to leave. We packed up our things quickly, eager to put the unsettling experience behind us. As we loaded the SUV, we found more footprints around the cabin. Closer this time, they seemed to be circling the place, as if whatever it was had been watching us. We didn't waste any more time and hit the road, driving back to Cedar Rapids. Intense silence. Weeks passed and life returned to normal, but the memory of that weekend lingered. We tried to rationalize it, coming up with various explanations, but none of them felt right. The unease stayed with me, a constant reminder that there are things out there we can't always explain about. A month later I got a call from Simon. He sounded excited and a bit nervous. He had done some research and found out that the area where we stayed had a history of strange occurrences. There were stories of people going missing, unexplained sightings, and mysterious footprints. He wanted to go back and investigate, convinced there was something more to uncover. Rafe and I were hesitant, but Simon's enthusiasm was contagious. We agreed to go back, but this time we would be better prepared. We brought along more gear, including cameras and a couple of guns, just in case we returned to the cabin determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. The first night was uneventful. We set up cameras around the cabin and took turns keeping watch. It wasn't until the second night that things took a turn. We were sitting around the fire again talking about what we hoped to find when we heard a low, guttural noise coming from the woods. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. Before sending a shiver down my spine, we grabbed our flashlights and guns, moving cautiously toward the sound. As we approached the tree line, we saw a large shadowy figure hunched over and moving quickly through the trees. We followed, keeping a safe distance, but it was too fast. It led us deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the cabin. We lost sight of it after a while, the darkness swallowing it up, but we could hear it moving through the underbrush circling us. We stood back to back, shining our flashlights in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Then, without warning, it charged at us. The next moments were a blow of chaos. I remember the flash of the gun, as Rafe fired, the loud bang echoing through the trees. The creature let out a horrifying screech and disappeared into the darkness. We stood there breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. We decided to head back to the cabin, sticking close together. When we got there, we found the place ransacked. Furniture was overturned and our belongings were scattered everywhere. The cameras we had set up were destroyed, smashed beyond repair, whatever it was had been inside. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep at first light. We packed up and left, vowing never to return. The drive back was silent. Each of us lost in our thoughts. We didn't speak of it again, not even among ourselves. Years have passed since that weekend, but the memory still haunts me. I've tried to forget, to move on, but there are nights when I wake up heart pounding, convinced. I can hear that rustling outside my window. I never did figure out what we encountered in those woods, and maybe it's better that way. When the old clock in my living room struck 6, I thought it was going to be another uneventful day. My name is Tyrus Voran, and this incident happened back in 2017. I've always had a knack for getting into strange situations, but nothing could prepare me for what I experienced that day. See? I'm the type of guy who loves the outdoors, hunting and hiking, but never in my wildest dreams did I think those interests would lead me to an encounter with something straight out of a nightmare. I live in a small town called Cedar Hill, nestled in the vast forests of Washington state. The place is serene and beautiful, a perfect getaway from the chaos of city life. That morning I decided to take a solo hike up the White Peak Trail, a less traveled path known for its breathtaking views and challenging terrain. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and I was eager to embrace the tranquility that nature had to offer. As I prepared for the hike, I packed my usual gear, a sturdy backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty hunting knife. Oddly enough, I left my rifle behind. I told myself it was because I wasn't hunting that day, just hiking, but maybe it was a lapse in judgment. Who knows? By noon I was deep into the trail, far from any signs of civilization. The trees towered above me, their canopies creating a mesmerizing dance of light and shadow on the forest floor. Birds chirped merrily and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at the presence of small animals. Everything seemed perfect, peaceful. Around 2 p.m., I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. I decided to take a break, refill my water bottle, and have a snack. As I sat by the stream, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing and even the rustling leaves had fallen silent. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. Then I heard a low, rhythmic thumping sound like heavy footsteps approaching. My heart began to race as I scanned the area, trying to pinpoint the source. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I stood up slowly, my knife in hand, every muscle in my body tense and ready. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A massive figure emerged from the dense foliage and my breath caught in my throat. Standing about 9 foot tall, covered in dark matted fur, was an unknown creature, the kind you only hear about in campfire stories. It had broad shoulders, long arms and a face that was a mix of human and ape-like features. My mind screamed Bigfoot, but I couldn't believe my eyes for a moment. We just stared at each other. The creature's presence was overwhelming, a mixture of raw power and intelligence. Then it let out a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the forest. The sound jolted me into action. I turned and ran, my survival instincts kicking in behind me. I heard the heavy footfalls of the creature giving chase. Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned as I sprinted through the forest. I knew couldn't outrun it forever. I needed a plan up ahead. I spotted a fallen tree with a hollow beneath it. Without thinking, I dove into the small space, curling up and holding my breath. The creature thundered past, its footsteps growing fainter. I waited, counting the seconds, trying to calm my racing heart. After what felt like an eternity, I crawled out and continued moving, quieter, now sticking to the shadows. I had to find a way back to the main trail, to safety, but the forest, once my sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of dangers. As I made my way through the trees, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A small makeshift campsite. It was abandoned, but signs of a struggle were evident: torn tents, scattered belongings and blood stains on the ground. I knelt to inspect the scene, dread pooling in my stomach. Whoever had been here didn't leave voluntarily. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air, and I whipped around, my heart pounding in my ears. It came from deeper in the forest, and, despite every instinct telling me to run the other way, I found myself moving towards it. Someone was in trouble, and I couldn't ignore it. I crept through the underbrush, staying low and silent. The screams grew louder, more desperate, as I neared a dense thicket. I peered through the leaves and saw it. The creature hunched over a figure on the ground. A young woman. Her face twisted in terror. The creature's massive hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her cries. My mind raced. I had to do something, but I tightened my grip on my knife, knowing it was a feeble weapon against such a beast, but I couldn't just stand by. I had to try, taking a deep breath. I emerged from the shadows, shouting and waving my arms to distract the creature. Hey, over here, you ugly bastard. The creature's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto me. It released the woman, who scrambled away and started towards me with deliberate, menacing strides. I backed up, slowly trying to lead it away from her. She managed to crawl into the thicket out of sight, and I felt a glimmer of hope. The creature was almost upon me when I spotted a fallen branch, thick and sturdy. I grabbed it, brandishing it like a club. The creature lunged and I swung with all my might, striking its shoulder. It roared in pain and fury, but didn't back down. It swiped at me with a massive paw, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. The creature loomed over me, its breath. Hot and rancid desperation fueled my movements. I rolled to the side narrowly, avoiding a crushing blow, and scrambled to my feet. I had to keep moving, keep fighting. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw the woman. She had found a large rock and was creeping up behind the creature, summoning every ounce of strength. She raised the rock and brought it down on the creature's head with a sickening thud. The creature staggered, disoriented, giving me the opening I needed. I lunged forward, plunging my knife into its side. The creature howled in agony, thrashing wildly. Blood poured from the wound and it stumbled back, its strength fading together. We had managed to wound it, but it wasn't over. Yet the creature, though weakened, wasn't giving up. It turned its rage towards the woman, and I knew we had to act fast. If you're still craving more tales from the wild, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on the next expedition.